I have to begin this evening with a question. This isn't some kind of a test, but it's a question of maybe how closely you listen to the Gospels from week to week. By a show of hands, how many of you feel a sense of deja vu? Like maybe you've heard this message before. I think you know what I mean. Let me assure you, this isn't some kind of a weird version of Groundhog Day. Last week, in our parish, we suspended our journey in ordinary time to celebrate the feast of St. Louis, our patron. And the gospel for his feast is Matthew's version of what we just heard tonight, the lesson on the Great Commandment. And as luck would have it, that's the gospel for today. We have the same lesson 2 weeks in a row. And rather than hear from our pastor and associates again, Father Keith said, why don't we let the deacons have a crack at it? So many of you may not know this, but usually at the end of the weekend, Father Keith's homilies end up in one of the baskets back there to be recycled. And I looked for it and I couldn't find it. But I think maybe Deacon Jeff got it before me. You threw it away. Okay. But in all seriousness, Jesus' message and his emphasis on the love of God and love of neighbor is just that important. And it also appears in the Gospel of Luke. And if you remember in the Gospel of Luke, he talks about love of neighbor, and the lawyer asks Jesus at the end, well, who is my neighbor? And that leads us into the whole thing in the parable of the Good Samaritan. This lesson of love appears in all three of the Synoptic Gospels. So what the lesson for us is that it must be pretty important. Why is it so important that we begin to practice this love more perfectly? Because God himself is love, right? And to love him, we must love what he loves. And God's love is completely unselfish. He created each and every one of us out of his love for us. And he loves his entire creation. God doesn't need us for his happiness. He brought us into existence out of love. You might say he loved us into existence. And as we surrender our life to him, it creates an endless stream of love that fills us up. He continually loves us no matter what. And the more we are filled up with this love, we can either hoard it and become selfish, or we can give it away to our neighbors. And as soon as we give it away, we're filled back up again with God's love. It's kind of a cycle that happens of us to be the conduit of his love reaching out to the whole world. And we do this for the sake of one another. And as soon as we do and we get replenished, that cycle continues. And if you look at the verses in our first hymn this evening, you'll see how that cycle of love can act. Each of us is called to sacrifice a part of ourselves for the need of others. Bishop Barron puts it that we must will the good of another just because they're the other. We should love that openly. And I must admit that many times I don't do that very well. I can easily rationalize that I have responsibilities that supersede yours, or that I have things that I need to always put ahead of others. And I can always tend to take care of number one first. That's what the world teaches us. But that's not what Jesus did, is it? In fact, Jesus himself is the key to why the love of God and our love of neighbors are so tightly linked. Think about it. It's because of who he is. He's not simply God. He's also human. He is that God-man. So he's the only being where humanity and divinity are joined as one. So to love Jesus is to love God, but it's also to love his humanity as one of our neighbors. And we can do that by loving that one person of Jesus. The how can become the difficult part. One expression that I heard recently that puts this to a unique perspective on this is to say that to do this, what you and I must do is to crucify our egos like Christ was crucified on the cross. Because when the selfish part of our ego dies, love rises. And doing this starts me on the road to being more unselfish, more loving, more giving, and more forgiving, and a true follower of Christ. In a practical sense, it means allowing my agenda and my plans to be put on hold to help someone else. I need to allow myself to be interrupted for the needs of others. I need to take time to put their needs ahead of mine as often as necessary to help them and to serve them. When it comes to interrupting my plans to help a friend who's hurting, it's not convenient, but it is love. If I have to change my schedule for a coworker who needs some help, that's not convenient either, but it is love. Am I supposed to give up my time, my free time, for a stranger? That's not convenient either, but it is love. And all of these are opportunities for us to practice the kind of love that Jesus calls us to. How often do I recognize them and respond? Because we have to remember that love is an act of the will. It's a choice that we can make. When those times come up and are presented to us, we can choose to suspend what we're doing and help somebody, or we can choose not to. So love is an act of the will. Now, maybe it is just a coincidence that we're having to hear this lesson 2 weekends in a row here at St. Louis. How many of you are like me, though? I don't believe in circumstances as much as I believe in divine providence, as much as I believe in the guidance and directions of the Holy Spirit, and as much as I believe that God speaks to us in many and mysterious ways. Perhaps this is just the message that each of us need. Perhaps this is the message that our parish needs to hear twice in a row. As we approach Jesus in the Eucharist today, at that moment when we're spiritually and physically and emotionally so close to Him, let's ask Him for this grace and the guidance and the direction from His Holy Spirit to respond to these opportunities in our life to love. Jesus, I'm praying to you right now as my God, my Creator, and as man, my neighbor. Help me to live this greatest commandment, this most important rule in the game of life, in unselfish love to everyone.